Most people don't live 10 different years. They live 1 year, repeated 10 times, different faces, slightly different places, but the same inner weather, the same patterns of fear, the same unfinished sentences echoing across new days. If this feels familiar, stay with me. We think we're moving forward because the calendar changes, because our routines evolve, because we tell ourselves we've grown. But if you listen closely, there's a rhythm beneath your decisions, an invisible loop shaped by what your nervous system calls safe. And what the nervous system calls safe, it will recreate endlessly, even if it hurts. People don't repeat years because they lack ambition. They repeat them because part of them believes repetition is survival. That's the quiet truth behind so many lives that look fine on the surface, yet feel haunted by sameness. Every pattern is a memory in disguise. Think of how your body tenses before conflict, even mild disagreement. Somewhere long ago, conflict meant danger. So you withdraw, appease, or shrink to maintain peace, not realizing that each retreat teaches your body to expect the same future again. You think you're avoiding chaos, but you're rehearsing powerlessness. The loop begins there, in protection. We build habits around what once kept us safe. The mind calls it wisdom. The body calls it home. And the soul quietly suffocates. You can see it in relationships. People who were once ignored tend to fall for those who overlook them again, not because they enjoy it, but because their nervous system recognizes the rhythm. It's the ache of familiarity, disguised as attraction. The known, even when painful, feels less frightening than the unknown. That's how the loop sustains itself. Pain, when predictable, feels safer than peace when uncertain. So you find yourself in the same emotional landscapes. New job, same exhaustion. New partner, same loneliness. New city, same emptiness. And part of you whispers, why does this keep happening? But another part, quieter still, already knows people repeat what they don't repair. When something remains unprocessed, grief, guilt, shame, it doesn't fade. It fragments. The mind buries it, but the body builds life around it, arranging circumstances to match its unfinished story. That's why patterns feel like fate. They are the body's way of asking to be seen. Notice how you always end up in situations where you must prove your worth. That isn't coincidence. That's an emotional echo. The psyche recreating the moment you first felt unworthy, hoping this time it ends differently. But without awareness, you just replay the same scene, with new actors, same script. Healing begins when you stop trying to win old battles on new stages. We repeat years because we confuse motion with evolution. You can move constantly and still orbit the same pain. Change without consciousness is just repetition, wearing new clothes. Every habit has a history. Every defense once made sense. The overthinker once needed control to feel safe. The pleaser once learned love had conditions. The avoidant once learned presence invited pain. These weren't flaws. They were adaptive miracles. But when safety becomes identity, growth feels like danger. That's why transformation doesn't begin with doing more. It begins with noticing. People often say, time heals. But time only passes. Awareness heals. You can live decades without truly meeting yourself. And until you do, every new year will quietly rearrange itself into the shape of the old one. Think of your life like a script you keep rewriting, but the first page never changes. You might alter the scenery, adjust the dialogue, but the emotional tone remains. The same longing, the same fear of loss, the same invisible contract. Don't let me be hurt again. And so, safety wins over freedom. Routine wins over possibility. Familiar suffering wins over unpredictable joy. You don't repeat the same year because you're lazy. You repeat it because your nervous system still believes the past is happening. Every reaction, every avoidance, every instinct to retreat. It's the body saying, "This looks like before." And the body moves faster than thought. It doesn't wait for logic. It reaches for memory. The loop isn't punishment. It's communication. When patterns return, they're not mocking you. They're inviting you. The same lessons will reappear until they're fully felt, because what you refuse to feel, you're forced to relive. We think understanding the past is enough, but understanding doesn't rewrite instinct. Healing means bringing tenderness into the exact place you once brought armor. It means feeling what was never safe to feel until the body learns the war is over. And this is why most people don't move on. They try to think their way out of what must be felt out. Awareness without embodiment is observation. Embodiment without awareness is repetition. The loop breaks when the two finally meet. Sometimes the cycle isn't even yours. You inherited it from parents who never felt safe enough to rest, from generations that equated peace with danger. Their survival patterns became your emotional DNA. You learned vigilance before you learned trust. You learned to earn before you learned to receive. So you keep repeating the same year, not because you love the pain, but because someone before you had to. And your body hasn't yet realized it's free. The question then becomes, what happens when you stop surviving and start remembering who you were before the loop began? That's where the real story starts to shift. When you begin to see that the life you keep recreating isn't a curse, but a compass pointing back to what still needs your tenderness. And sometimes that tenderness begins not with fixing yourself, but with finally listening to the parts that never stopped waiting to be seen. Because underneath every repeated year is a self still hoping for one different ending, not through control, but through presence. The loop continues until you no longer need it, but to reach that moment, to step out of the orbit of the past, you must first recognize the quiet loyalty your pain has had to your survival. And that realization changes everything. It's where the ground begins to tremble, where the old scripts start to loosen, where the nervous system hesitates between fear and possibility. It's the moment right before change begins to whisper, what if safety was never the same as peace? There's a moment, quiet but unmistakable, when your old life no longer fits, but your new one hasn't begun yet. It's the space between endings and beginnings, the strange silence after the old pattern has lost its power, but before freedom feels familiar. Most people turn back here because the body interprets uncertainty as danger, even when the mind calls it growth. That's the hidden gravity of the loop. Not just that we repeat, but that we return when comfort calls. People often mistake the unfamiliar calm that follows awareness for emptiness. They say, something feels wrong, when peace finally arrives, because for so long, chaos was the only thing that felt alive. When your nervous system has danced with adrenaline for years, stillness can feel like abandonment. So the mind looks for old rhythms to reawaken. A small argument, a distraction, a rush of worry. Anything to fill the silence that healing creates. That's the paradox of transformation. It first feels like loss. Loss of identity, loss of urgency, loss of who you were when you were trying so hard to survive. You grieve not only the pain, but also the person who was built around it. That grief is sacred. It's the evidence that something is changing. The repetition begins to fade when you stop trying to feel better and start allowing yourself to feel different. Better is what the old self wanted, the one obsessed with control, progress, approval. Different is what the deeper self wants, the one that remembers stillness, authenticity, and rest. Notice how every major change begins with confusion. Confusion is just the nervous system recalibrating, the body unlearning what danger feels like. Most people misinterpret that confusion as failure, so they go back to the old script for clarity. But clarity often lives on the other side of not knowing. You can't think your way into a new nervous system. You have to feel your way there. This is why people relapse into old relationships, old habits, old identities, not because they want to suffer, but because the mind hasn't yet built safety in the unfamiliar. The brain says, I know how to survive this pain. I don't yet know how to survive peace. The repetition continues until peace feels safe. That's the unseen work of healing, teaching your body that calm isn't the same as danger, that love doesn't have to come with fear, that attention doesn't have to come through crisis. We often imagine healing as a straight line, trauma, awareness, growth. But real healing moves like a spiral. You revisit old patterns, but each time from a slightly higher vantage point. The scenery looks the same, but your position has changed. It's easy to mistake that spiral for failure. You think, I'm back where I started. But look closely. The conversation feels different now. You pause before reacting. You sense the echo, but don't obey it. That pause, that breath, that's evolution in disguise. Growth isn't the absence of triggers. It's the increase of choice once triggered. And this is where time starts to unfold differently. Because every time you choose presence over pattern, you create a new timeline. The repeated year starts to dissolve the moment you notice the micro moment before the automatic response. That split second is the door out of the loop. But most of us rush past that door because we mistake awareness for discomfort. We feel the old pain stir and assume something's wrong, when in truth, something old is asking to be felt. Maybe for the first time, pain, when fully felt, doesn't repeat. This is why people who truly heal often seem softer, not stronger. They've stopped fighting the loop. They've listened to it until it no longer needs to speak so loudly. Every defense mechanism, perfectionism, withdrawal, performance, was once a brilliant adaptation. But when survival ends and those adaptations remain, they become prisons. That's why awareness must be followed by compassion. Without compassion, awareness becomes judgment. You end up shaming yourself for the very patterns that once saved you. Compassion is what turns knowledge into healing. It's the act of saying to your old self, I understand why you did that. I see the fear beneath it. Thank you for keeping me alive. Once the body feels seen, it doesn't need to keep repeating the same story. Think of it like a child tugging your sleeve, repeating the same question over and over, not because they love the question, but because they're waiting for the safety of your full attention. That's what your patterns are doing. They keep tugging until you finally look, not with analysis, but with tenderness. And when you do, something shifts quietly. The loop begins to loosen. You start noticing space between reaction and response, between fear and choice. That space is freedom. People assume freedom is dramatic, quitting jobs, moving cities, changing everything. But often, freedom begins in small, invisible ways. It's saying no when you would have said yes out of fear. It's staying still when your anxiety demands action. It's speaking honestly, even if your voice trembles. Each of those moments tells your nervous system, we're safe now. Safety is what ends repetition, not willpower, not motivation, because repetition is just fear trying to find safety again and again. When safety returns, repetition becomes unnecessary. But that safety isn't given. It's grown. Slowly, through presence, through gentleness, through choosing to stay when you want to run. That's when life begins to shift from repetition to rhythm. You stop reenacting the past and start composing something new. But here's the quiet truth. The world won't celebrate that change right away, because when you stop looping, you stop matching the unhealed patterns of others. And that distance can feel lonely. Old relationships may fall away, not out of rejection, but resonance. When you stop playing a role, the dynamics that relied on that role begin to dissolve. That loneliness is the echo of liberation. It's the silence left behind when you stop performing what pain taught you to be. And it hurts, not because you're doing something wrong, but because you're entering a part of life that few people ever allow themselves to reach. The place beyond the loop is quiet, uncertain, and beautifully real. Here, the future is no longer a copy of the past, but the mind still trembles, wondering if it can trust that it's a tender, trembling threshold, the moment when you've stopped running, but haven't yet learned how to rest. And that's where the deepest pattern begins to reveal itself. Because sometimes the loop doesn't repeat outwardly anymore. It begins repeating internally through subtle thoughts, invisible self-doubt, old whispers of, who do you think you are? The question isn't whether the pattern will return. The question is, when it does, will you recognize it soon enough to stay awake? It's strange, isn't it? You can grow, heal, change everything visible, and yet still hear the old voice, faint but persistent, whispering from beneath your ribs. The voice that says, don't relax yet. It's not safe to be this open. That's how the final version of the loop survives. Not through circumstance, but through belief. You start realizing that the repetition was never truly in the events. It was in your interpretation of them. The same situation can arrive as a lesson or a trap, depending on the lens you wear. And that lens was crafted long before you could choose it. Every person carries a private definition of safety, a map drawn in childhood, updated by heartbreak, reinforced by fear. When life presents something new, love that doesn't demand sacrifice, success without burnout, peace without tension. The old map doesn't recognize it. So, the mind tries to correct reality back to the known. That's the final repetition. We reshape new moments to match old meanings. You might find yourself suspicious when someone treats you kindly, or restless when life becomes calm, or dismissive of opportunities that arrive too easily, because ease doesn't fit the language of your past. It takes enormous courage to not translate the present through the vocabulary of the old wound. This is why healing never feels like moving on. It feels like learning a new emotional language, syllable by syllable, until your body finally understands the difference between peace and boredom, between love and control, between stillness and emptiness. Most people never reach that stage because they expect healing to feel like happiness. But happiness is an outcome. Healing is a process of disorientation. You lose your old reference points, the emotions that once guided you. Urgency, guilt, fear lose their authority. And for a while, you don't know what to trust. That's when the temptation to go back becomes strongest. The loop whispers, "At least the pain was familiar." And part of you almost believes it. But then something small interrupts the cycle. Maybe a moment of self-kindness. Maybe a realization that the world didn't end when you disappointed someone. Maybe just a breath that feels different. That's the birth of new safety. It never arrives dramatically. It arrives quietly as softness. People often think breakthroughs are loud, but real ones happen in silence, in the tiny pause where you no longer need to explain yourself, defend yourself, or rush to fix what isn't broken. That pause is the beginning of a new year, not on the calendar, but in the soul. When you stop repeating, you begin remembering, not remembering events, remembering essence. The self you were before you learned to protect yourself from love. The child who believed connection was natural. The being who once trusted life enough to play repetition fades not because life gets easier, but because you begin relating to it differently. You stop asking, "How do I control this?" and start asking, "How can I stay present with this?" And presence breaks every pattern that control could never touch. You start seeing the pattern everywhere, not as a curse, but as code. The friend who keeps choosing chaos because calm reminds them of neglect. The coworker who overworks because stillness feels like failure. The lover who withdraws because intimacy reminds them of being trapped. You begin to see that everyone is repeating something, searching for a way to finish a sentence that once ended in pain. That awareness softens you. Because judgment dissolves when you see that most people aren't difficult. They're just defensive. They're protecting the part of themselves that never got to rest. And you realize, so were you. That realization marks the real end of the loop. Not when you've healed everything, but when you can look at your patterns with tenderness instead of shame. Shame keeps the story closed. Tenderness opens it. When you can say, "Of course I did that. It made sense then," you stop fighting the past. And when you stop fighting the past, the present stops repeating it. From there, life doesn't suddenly become perfect, but it becomes alive. The same challenges return, but you meet them with different eyes. You no longer mistake triggers for truth. You no longer confuse fear with intuition. You no longer need to earn what's already meant for you. That's when the repetition turns into rhythm, a flow that includes contrast, yet doesn't collapse under it. You begin to trust your seasons: expansion, contraction, stillness, motion. You no longer rush winter, because you've learned spring always returns. When the same situations appear again, and they will, you start listening for new meanings. You ask, what part of me is being invited forward this time? Because repetition only becomes suffering when we refuse its invitation. Imagine each recurring experience as a teacher who refuses to leave until you say thank you. Not because they want to punish you, but because they're trying to return you to yourself. Every repeated year carries an unopened gift. Inside it is a lesson about love, safety, trust, or power that your younger self never got to complete. When you finally open it, the pattern stops knocking. But the most beautiful thing, even after you outgrow the loop, it still lives somewhere in you. Not as a wound, but as wisdom. You stop resenting your past and start respecting its endurance. The years you thought were wasted become sacred, each one a rehearsal for awakening. Because repetition was never failure. It was the soul's way of practicing the same lesson until the heart could understand it. When you finally understand, there's no fireworks, just quiet, a silence that feels vast and gentle, as if the world just exhaled with you. You begin to notice time differently. Mornings feel slower, small joys feel larger. You stop chasing the next version of yourself and start listening to the one who's already here. You realize you never needed a new year to begin again. You just needed a new awareness, one that could hold both your past and your possibility in the same breath. And when that awareness arrives, life stops feeling like something to escape from and starts feeling like something to experience fully. The same streets look different. The same people sound new, because you're no longer listening for danger. You're listening for depth. That's when repetition becomes rhythm, and rhythm becomes meaning. And meaning, not change, not progress, not success, is what finally ends the loop. Meaning turns survival into story. It gives shape to everything you've lived, so the years stop blending and begin belonging. Maybe that's what healing really is. Not the erasure of pain, but the integration of it. Not the escape from the loop, but the moment you realized the loop was always guiding you back here, to presence, to softness, to the quiet, continuous unfolding of who you've always been. And even now, as you listen, something in you already knows this, because the part of you that grew tired of repeating didn't die. It's the same part that brought you here, seeking understanding. So if you feel that quiet ache, the sense that life is inviting you to begin differently, maybe that's not restlessness. Maybe that's memory. The memory of who you were before you built walls around your aliveness. And perhaps the invitation isn't to destroy the loop, but to walk it consciously until it turns from a circle into a spiral, and the same year becomes the next chapter. Because maybe we were never meant to escape our patterns, only to outgrow the need to hide inside them. And in that outgrowing, life doesn't repeat. It ripens. So as you step into whatever comes next, don't rush to feel healed. Just stay awake. Stay gentle. Stay curious enough to see what happens when you stop running from the echo and start listening to what it's been trying to say. Maybe that's how time finally opens. not in a grand awakening, but in a quiet realization. You were never stuck in the same year. You were simply being shown, again and again, the exact door that leads you home.